The city lights were always too bright for Adrian to see the stars. Every night, the glow of screens and the endless hum of machines filled his world with a cold kind of order. He lived surrounded by steel, glass, and the rush of people who spoke quickly, moved quickly, and rarely paused long enough to feel the ground beneath their feet. For years, Adrian had believed that this was enough. Progress, reason, numbers, facts. Faith, in his eyes, belonged to those who feared the unknown or clung to old myths. He called himself free, but in the quiet hours before sleep, when the noise of the city dimmed and the walls of his apartment pressed close, he felt a weight that had no name. It was not pain exactly, nor loneliness, but an emptiness that sat between his ribs like a stone. He tried to fill it with motion, late-night work, loud gatherings, bright distractions. Yet each morning it returned, heavier still. There were moments, small, fleeting, when his heart asked questions his mind refused to hold. Why, after so many achievements, did the nights feel so hollow? Why, with all the tools and answers he had collected, did the silence still grow? One autumn evening, tired of his own routine, Adrian walked without direction. The streets led him away from the tall buildings into older parts of the city, where the lamps glowed softer and the air smelled faintly of bread. There, hidden between narrow alleys, stood a small building with warm light spilling from its open door. He paused, uncertain, watching figures inside washing their hands and faces with quiet care. Their voices were low, their gestures deliberate, and the air around them seemed different from the restless streets outside. He stepped closer, expecting to be turned away, but no one stopped him. One of the men, a silver-haired elder with calm eyes, nodded in greeting and offered him tea without a word. Adrian stayed by the doorway, listening as a call rose gently through the air. A sound unlike any he had known. It was not a song, nor a command, but it settled over the stones like a slow tide. That night, he returned home unsettled, not by fear, but by the unfamiliar peace that had touched him. The next evening he came again, telling himself it was curiosity. The evening after, he lingered longer, watching them pray. No one preached to him, no one pressed a book into his hands. They simply carried on, their lives marked by a rhythm he could not yet name. Something in that stillness began to work upon him, not as a hammer upon iron, but as water upon stone, slow and patient. Days turned into weeks, and the small building became a place of quiet refuge for Adrian, though he still told no one. At work, his colleagues spoke of markets, deadlines, and distant vacations, but his mind often drifted to the stillness he had found in that narrow street. He began to notice how hurried his steps were, how often his words carried sharpness instead of care, how the world he had built left no room for the softness he had glimpsed. One evening he stayed after the others had left, and the elder with the silver beard asked him gently what it was that drew him back. Adrian hesitated. It felt strange to speak aloud what he had not yet named. "Peace," he said at last, or something like it. A kind of quiet I didn't know I was missing. The elder smiled faintly, as though he had heard such words many times before, and told him that the heart often remembers what the mind has forgotten. They spoke of life, not as a ladder to climb, but as a trust to keep. Of time, not as an enemy to outrun, but as a gift that asks to be tended. Adrian listened, and for the first time in many years, his questions were not met with arguments or cold definitions, but with patience. He began to make small changes, He left his phone aside when walking home. He ate without the noise of screens. He sat in silence for a few minutes each dawn, watching the pale light spill over the city. At first it felt awkward, like wearing a new coat, but with each day it settled more naturally. The men at the building spoke sometimes of their faith, but never as a banner to wave, only as a path that steadied their steps. One recited a verse about mercy that forgives even the restless wanderer. Another spoke of how gratitude, even for the smallest breath, could turn the heart from iron to clay. Adrian found himself staying longer each visit, not to debate, but simply to be near that atmosphere. One rainy night, as drops tapped against the windows and the city outside rushed on without pause, he asked the elder whether someone like him, someone who had denied, doubted, even mocked belief, could truly begin again. The elder poured him tea and said that the door was always open, that the one who made the mountains and the storms had not turned away from those who had once turned away from him. "It is not the weight of the years that matters," the elder said, "but the step you choose to take now." Those words followed Adrian home, and for the first time in many years, sleep came without the usual restless turning. He dreamed not of cities or arguments, but of a wide plain under starlight where a river flowed endlessly, clear and calm, and he stood upon its bank with bare hands, feeling that the water waited for him to drink. The nights grew colder, and winter wrapped the city in slow, silver breath. Adrian still lived in the same apartment, walked the same streets, and passed the same hurried faces. But within him something had begun to shift, like snow under thaw. The questions that once circled him like restless birds now seemed to find a place to land. He read quietly, not in secret shame, but in a private search, verses translated into a language his heart could follow. He learned that the path he had stumbled upon was not built upon blind submission, as he once mocked, but upon remembrance of a Creator who asked for no wealth, no towers, only a heart willing to return. One evening the elder spoke of a phrase, simple yet immense, that many had spoken before him when they chose to step through the open door of faith. A testimony of oneness, a bearing witness. Adrian listened, his hands resting upon the warm clay cup, and for the first time in his life, he felt that surrender was not a loss, but a release. He spent the following days walking by the riverbanks, watching ice drift and scatter. He thought of the years he had filled with noise, the debates he had carried like armor, the walls he had raised out of pride. They had not protected him. They had only kept the light out. When he returned to the small building again, the men were preparing for the evening prayer. No one asked him to join. No one pressed upon him a demand. Yet when the moment came, he stepped forward, his voice steady, though his heart raced, and spoke the words that declared there was no deity but God, and that the messenger was his servant and guide. It was a sentence of few syllables, but it fell from his lips like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through the quiet lake of his being. That night, the city lights did not feel so blinding. The emptiness between his ribs softened, not by magic, but by a presence he could no longer deny. He felt no sudden perfection, no wings upon his shoulders, but a door had opened within him, and fresh air came rushing through. In the days that followed, he began to learn the motions of prayer. His hands trembled at first, his words stumbled, yet each bow and rise felt like drawing a curtain aside to let dawn in. He washed his hands, his face, his heart in silence. He did not abandon his life or flee to far lands. He carried this new rhythm into the same streets where he once walked lost. And in that rhythm, he began to see others differently. The woman hurrying with heavy bags, the child staring at winter clouds, the driver waiting in the cold. Each face held a story, each breath a gift, and for the first time in years, Adrian wanted to give thanks more than he wanted to win. Spring approached with its hesitant rains and thin grass pushing through the gray edges of the city stones. Adrian's steps no longer felt as heavy. They carried a kind of quiet strength, born not of conquest, but of return. He began to meet others who once carried the same hollowness he had known. A young woman who hid her doubt behind laughter. An older man who claimed that belief was for the weak. A student who wandered through nights of noise, seeking meaning in screens. He did not preach to them with raised voice or fierce words. He only listened, shared his tea, spoke of the stillness he had found when he finally stopped running from the questions that never left. Some followed him to that same warm-lit building, hesitant at first, then drawn by something deeper than argument. One evening, as the rain fell gently outside, he stood beside two of them, while they whispered the same simple words he had once spoken, words that washed over their tired souls like the first breath of dawn. And in that moment, Adrian felt a warmth not of pride but of gratitude, that he had been allowed to be a bridge where once he had been a wall. Life did not suddenly become without struggle. The city still roared, the world still demanded, the nights still tested him with old shadows. But now each trial was met not with empty defiance, but with remembrance of the one who forgives, who guides, who waits for the heart to turn. He learned to rise before the sun, to let the water cool his skin and the earth steady his forehead. He learned that peace was not the absence of storm, but the anchor that holds when the winds return. In time, those who once called him stubborn began to see a light in his face they could not name. He spoke little of his past pride. He spoke instead of mercy, of the freedom he found in surrender, of the strange and gentle strength that grew when he placed his trust not in chance, not in the restless chase of more, but in the one who had always been near. On a late spring night, as the stars finally pierced the thinning city haze, he walked again by the riverbank, where he once wandered lost. The water still flowed, endless and patient, and in its reflection he saw not the man who sought to measure every shadow, but the man who had learned to bow before the unseen and rise lighter than before. And as the wind moved softly through the budding trees, he whispered a prayer, not only for himself, but for all those still wandering with heavy hearts, that they too might find the door that opens without demand, and step through it with a soul ready to breathe